Thanks everyone for joining us today. This is Brent Bushy with the Public School Resource Center. I'm really excited to have two folks joining us. We have Wes Fryer with Casady Public Schools. Wes is the Technology Integration and Innovation Specialist. We're going to explore that title a little bit. Sounds pretty exciting to me. And Jamila MacArthur joins us, formerly of the OPSRC, but now partner of school design services with Transcend. So a couple of disclaimers I want to start off with. Today is March 17th. This is St. Patrick's Day. This is the day after schools were closed. That's important to note because we're going to try and give guidance and support to schools through this podcast. But what we say today could be out of date by the end of the day. And so we want to make sure that the folks keep in context. We're trying to do the very best that we can, but this is a fluid situation. And if we give stuff that goes out of date, we just want to keep folks to keep that in mind. With that being said, I really appreciate you two joining us today, and I know everyone's got crazy schedules right now, and so thank you for taking this time.
Absolutely, glad to be here.
So the focus of this podcast is going to be on what can schools do in support of students and families, and we're going to have two areas of focus. First, the state announced yesterday we're shutting down schools through April 6th. We have a call this afternoon with the State Department with all schools to talk about all of the mechanics of what that means. Technically speaking, I think all public school instruction is officially shut down. We'll get additional guidance on that. But we also know that teachers are humans, and that teachers like to teach, and we know that families need some support. Dad right here is going to need some help with his two munchkins, and I'm sure families statewide are going to need some support. So we want to focus on first, what can schools do during the shutdown period, and but also what can schools be thinking about? Because I think we all agree, while things may change after April 6th, and it's not entirely impossible that we go back to traditional school, it's probably going to look different after April 6th. And maybe that's a continued shutdown, but I think we're going to see something moving to more of a mixed, blended environment with less interactions while this pandemic rages on. So obviously things are going to change. The whole world has flipped upside down in the last few days. But hopefully this podcast can serve as sort of initial guidance as well as some longer term thoughts. So maybe I'll pause there and get you guys just sort of initial reactions to sort of what's going on and where you can go. Wes, you want to jump in first?
You bet. So I have spent my career in public education, but about 4 years ago, I moved over to Casady, and we are a private school, but we have been the last 2 weeks at basically full speed ahead planning for what we're calling remote learning. Some people call it learning at home. But this realization about what was happening has hit us at different times. But basically, we've been putting a remote learning plan into place, which actually just got announced yesterday. And my responsibility has been a lot of the preparation for the instructional support resources for students. What I will say at the outset is, students are in all kinds of different situations, and so are families. And so while there are, public schools here in Oklahoma that are one-to-one with a device, internet connectivity is very different. And, just the whole, being quarantined, limiting the social interaction, all of this is going to put a tremendous stress and strain on all of us. And so what I want to start talking about at the very outset is wellness routines and self-care. There's a link that I've started a Google Doc as getting ready for today. And so I have a shortened link for that, and maybe we can put that in the show notes. It's wfryer, so WFRYER.me/March17, because today's March 17th. And that'll just take you to this Google Doc. And so some of the best resources that I've had, or that I've encountered so far, and that we can talk through a little bit, are actually from one of our learning platforms. We use one called Seesaw. And so they've got a great document. It's also a Google Doc. And it's just called Family Resources, but there's 5 things that they put here. And I would say, we don't know how long this is going to go. I think that we want to enjoy spring break for sure. In fact, my wife and I were just talking about that this morning, because there's a tendency. It's very difficult when we don't have that external routine. It's challenging. I've worked from home for 5 years. It's hard. It's not easy. So the document that Seesaw has for family talks about establishing a routine, creating designated learning spaces, beginning and ending each day with a check-in, scheduling physical activity and social interaction, and supporting your child's emotional needs. So I think we're going to talk today a little bit about content, and there are just some really great resources. And I'd say also at the outset, don't think you need to go out and pay for stuff. I talked to a teacher today who'd already been buying stuff on Teachers Pay Teachers. And there are great resources out there that are commercial, but there's also fantastic free resources as well. So my number one thing is, let's start with wellness. Let's start with self-care, and let's think about routines, because I'm teaching 5th and 6th grade computer class this year, and so being back in the classroom, it's so abundantly clear how important routines are to students. They're important to us as families. This is going to be a new normal in a lot of different respects. And so I think talking together as a family about what our routine might look like and how are we going to be well. We talk about social distancing. We're going to need social media distancing. I need it too, right? If I've got my phone up all the time and I'm seeing all these headlines, man, it's making me anxious. And so I think a big place to start is on wellness and self-care.
Great. No, I couldn't agree more. I'm going to have lots of reactions, but Jamila, jump in here.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me and Wes on. What we all know about Oklahoma's teachers is that nothing can stop them from teaching. So you're right, Brent. We're thinking of creative ways right now to reach our families and our students. And also, I feel like to reach each other, and really leverage our relationships with colleagues and be able to collaborate in order to meet our kids' needs. I shared some resources online last night, and I got messages of concern from teachers that are saying, what about my kids without internet access? And what do I do to reach them? And so that Wes hit the nail on the head when he said we have to think about self-care, and not only for students, but for ourselves as adults whose realities are very different. When we get our energy from being around kids every day, this looks very different. And so how do we do that? And I also think, about our families and our parents right now, because I'm an educator, but it's a whole different ballgame to teach your own kids, right? So what makes that accessible? What does learning look like at home? If you don't want your kids to be on devices for a chunk of time, what sorts of projects could they engage in? What resources should you access? And I think there are lists after list after list that can be very overwhelming. And so I think if we can just zoom out and talk about concepts and things that are just best practice and allow yourself some flexibility within that, it could be really helpful.
Yeah. So actually, one thing I do want to make sure we don't forget, I've been looking at a lot of the different lists, and Transcend does have a list of resources for educators and for families. I think it's pretty fantastic. What is that website, Jamila?
Yeah, so that web is going to be transcendeducation.org/coronavirus.
Okay, and we're going to have this up in up in our show notes. We'll also, on the OPSRC's webpage, we're going to have a resource page. Everyone's doing this right now. We're going to try and keep that organized around different resources. So we'll have that there. We'll make sure to have all of our contact information available. So if folks need to reach out, please do not hesitate. I've seen some good memes, both funny and useful, on the schedule. So I think, Wes, you touched on it. I think schools can easily direct to that. I'm a creature of habit and routine, so everything's kind of thrown off for me right now, and kids are the same way. So I think making sure that families understand that. I think it really was. You hit it on. We need to focus on education, but we also need to take care of each other. This is our second podcast we're doing today. We're going to do 4 today. And the fourth one's going to be on mental health and wellness. We've got some counselors who are going to get on and talk. This is traumatic, right? Like our whole world is flipped upside down. Probably the only thing I think in our collective lifetime that's anywhere near in the realm is 9/11. And the difference here is this affects all of us, right? We are all going to know someone, if we don't already, know someone that's going to get this virus. Heck, we may all end up getting it. And 9/11 was a national tragedy, but it didn't hit us the same way. So I think keeping in mind that the traumatic experience of this is important. Plus, humans by nature don't like change, and now all of our schedules and routines have been flipped upside down. So just recognizing that and realizing the need to sort of give each other a little bit of grace, but also then how do you then get into a new routine, and establishing that routine I think is pretty critical. So we'll have some links up to some sample schedules and things like that, and I think that schools can absolutely do that. I do want to jump into, so, Wes, you touched on, there's free resources out there. It seems like all kinds of content providers have opened up their firewalls right now. Talk about sort of some of the places you think schools should be looking at, especially, number one, directing families just to go get, some content. This may be a self question because my 9-year-old is already driving me nuts. But also, like, so sort of short run, what can families do? And then post April 6th, what should schools be looking at for potential curriculum resources?
You bet. Well, my first answer may come as a surprise to some folks who know I'm really digital, but it's really going to be to not think digital, to think about home learning. We used to be a much more agricultural society. We used to be much more multi-generational as far as, farm families and the ways in which we had multiple generations living together. It's different today, but there's a lot of things that we can learn together, that are practical, right? Cooking. I was just telling my wife, hey, maybe this is going to give us some time to really hone in on our budget stuff that we've been talking about. Things around the house. Thankfully, I will say this personally. I mean, I've thought about living out, rural area or whatever. There's a lot fewer chores that have to be done today in order for just life to happen. But this is an opportunity, if we're quarantined together, perhaps to rediscover some hobbies, to think about curiosity. One of the things I'd encourage families as well as teachers to Google are passion projects. There have been a number of teachers that have done some work. It comes from different places, but one is from Google. Google has a thing where they will let employees work on a passion project for 10%. I think they call it something else, but basically, it's something that the person is really curious about. And Google gives them time to actually work on that because they recognize that can bring benefit, back to them. So I think we need to not just think narrowly in terms of standards and content and curriculum, but let's think about ways that we're going to be able to utilize our environment. Good news, smartphones, right? They're fairly ubiquitous. My wife taught at Positive Tomorrows downtown in Oklahoma City for 4 years before she came to Casady. This is her second year to teach third grade there. All of her students at Positive Tomorrows, all of the kids are homeless. And so she was amazed at still the number of smartphones that parents had, the ways that she connected with them. So my first recommendation is think analog, think stuff that we can do together, think about things you can read together. Okay, think about, and if we do have an internet connected device, of course, there's great free resources from the public library. I've learned from our librarian, Sora, Sora, is the app that is now the new connect to all the ebooks and e-resources and things like that. So, hey, do you have a library card? You don't have to go to the library in order to get resources. So how can we read things together? How can we watch things together? How can we reflect? I mean, a lot of learning is reflecting, but it's also doing. So, maybe there's something we're going to be able to work on in the garage, or we're going to be able to do something in the kitchen, all of that. But the second thing I'll say, and I can elaborate more on this later, as teachers, we need to be thinking about staying where we're comfortable. There are a million things out there in terms of, websites and platforms and tools and all these things. We're encouraging our teachers to, number one, have an interactive platform with their students. So for a lot of our teachers, that's Google Classroom. It's free. But for a lot of our teachers, it's also Seesaw, which we pay for the school version. But as an individual teacher, you can use that as well. Honestly, that's the number one platform my wife has been using to connect with her students because it works so well on a smartphone, Android or iPhone or laptop. And I think that we need to consider how we're going to give suggested activities to students, but also, we're gonna get into a new mode of learning. And I'll just say this: as a teacher, because I supported teachers for 5 years at Texas Tech as the director of distance learning, one of my number one goals is to try and minimize the number of times my students or my parents have to email me for help. Email is really kind of a dumpster fire, is just my opinion overall. Like it can be so crazy, and you don't want that to be your only line of interaction or your first line of interaction with all of your students and your parents. We're going to use email. We're going to need to use email. Your students may not have email, so there's a lot of layers to that. But I think, if you pick a platform, maybe your school already has one. I know in Edmond, they're using Canvas. They've been doing that for a while, but Google Classroom is fantastic. The thing that I like about Seesaw is that it can also be student initiated. So if a student is doing a passion project, getting kids to share their world and what they're doing, what kind of projects are they doing, giving them a chance to have some choices. So there's definitely going to be an array of choices. I think the challenge is it's overwhelming. So if teachers are familiar with a tool, that's really good. And then I also just think using this smartphone, finding ways that you can record a video, put yourself, sharing yourself as far as your check-ins with your students, pointing to some resources, but then using an online learning platform. And if you don't have one now, look at Seesaw, look at Google Classroom, and having that as an interactive hub that you can use, with students. And so, it's going to vary obviously with circumstances, what parents are going to face, but we've never had a better day with more resources to have this kind of experience together. And so I also think, drawing on each other's ideas, being connected as we are listening to this podcast. I wrote a post last night about Twitter and other ways to be connected. And so, Facebook and these kinds of, we're going to see a lot of communities and groups that are going to develop organically as these needs are, being faced by families all over the place. So I'm sure there's going to be some good Facebook groups and other places that we can connect to get additional ideas, and also to think about maybe how we'll do school differently, because it won't have to just be, it doesn't now, solo, do this by yourself. How can we collaborate? How can we work together? Those kinds of things are going to be, they are possible, but in the traditional classroom, there's a lot of factors that play into maybe why we're not doing those things. And with remote learning, we don't just need to think about replicating what we've done before. We can use these tools to collaborate and to really give students some choice and voice, and to, be able to have some meaningful learning experiences. We're going to remember this time. This is an unprecedented time in all of our lives. And so I also think, just lastly, taking it one step at a time, taking it slow, because all of us have different sets of experiences with these different resources and tools. And so I think if we can start with baby steps, but we utilize some of the learning that people who've been doing online learning for a long time, bring to us, like with the stuff we just talked about, schedules, routines, check-ins, and then thinking a little bit more, maybe even like an elementary teacher or a primary teacher with centers and activities. You're going to have different activities to do, and students will probably be able to make choices about those things. But how do we bring those back, do some sharing, do some reflecting? How do we have an interactive space where we can come together and do that after we have been, doing whatever activities that we are doing here at our house?
Yeah. So lots there. Number one, selfishly, you mentioned Sora, Sora, the app. That's a e-reader. Is that a replacement for Libby? Are you familiar with Libby at all?
I think it is. So this is one of the things we've realized with our librarian, like, hey, we need to be educating ourselves better about our resources. So my understanding is that Sora is a tool for, and I guess it's on my iPad. I'll have to grab it. Rachel, can you grab it? Yeah, it's all schools and public libraries. So it's like a next generation. So anybody can get a library card, and you can be accessing through your library their electronic resources. And then if your school is connected there too, yes, it's a free app. And then you just log in with your library number that you get from your school librarian.
Cool. Yeah, and I use the Libby app, Libby, which I think just connects with public libraries, but that's a pretty great resource. And I might have all my parents and in-laws' library cards entered in there as well. So
That's right.
I would never admit to breaking.
Hey, this has never been a better day for librarians to share their resources, right? Because the public library is for everyone, and there are more digital resources available via both the public library and the school library than ever before.
Amen. So Jamila, let me set you up here. So Wes, cast a broad net, I think very wisely focused on things we can do at home. This doesn't just have to be traditional education. God forbid we learn how to work together and get things done. I will assure you the Bushy Family Boot Camp is going to be enacted both for physical fitness as well as for cleaning. This house is going to be pristine in the next few weeks. So, which if you know my family is not generally a strength, but so I think that's critical, right? Like we're going to have to learn to kind of get along in new ways and different ways. And I think that there can be some fun stuff too. I'm going to have one heck of a garden this year, right? So my garden has suffered the last few years. So I'm looking forward to that stuff. And I think that families should be encouraged to do that kind of, it's sort of going back to the basics, right? So there's that. And then there's, I think, very, very wise comments about the, schools need to be looking at an online learning management system, even if you're doing, so maybe I'd tee up here, Jamil, talk about like the online learning management and how you can organize. It doesn't just have to be digital exercises that you're exercising in that online learning management platform. So that's one question I want to kind of tee up, but also just sort of general reaction to what Wes said and other thoughts that came to mind.
Yeah. So I'll start with the general reaction to what Wes said, just because it'll close that loop and then we'll open the other.
Yeah.
Wes, I was like, I almost had everything written down that you were sharing, and so I cannot co-sign it enough. But I just want to emphasize the critical aspect of setting that schedule with your kids, no matter what age they are. They're 4 years old, they're 5 years old. That, of course, increases buy-in, and they just like really internalize and understand that, and they have voice and choice as well. So if you can set that schedule, if you can do it weekly, wonderful. Days are changing as we know it, but as much structure you can provide for kids up front, the better. And then I would echo too the passion projects, digital or physical, like something that adds value to your community in a time where we are a little panicked, right? And worried about our circles, our small circles. So how are we thinking about others and engaging with others and just connecting, whether that's writing notes to elderly neighbors who are right now not able to get out and about and who shouldn't be, would be an idea. FaceTiming grandparents who are probably desperately missing their kiddos, just connecting with each other and getting back to just talking, right? We're so used to texting or emailing one-line responses, and I just think about the world of possibilities that this provides us to be able to connect in real, meaningful ways. I'd also like talk about the physical outlet. So it's kind of yucky outside right now, but there are things like Go Noodle and the 7-minute workout that many people start their day with, or a disengaged stress activity. So let's do some breathing together, or yoga, especially because kids can feel our stress right now too. So what does that look like for us to decompress together and to really focus before we set out on our day? And as soon as we can get outside, like let's get outside as much as possible and get that exercise. And also just like staying aware of what's going on in the world in ways that may be non-corona focused. So sites like Positive News, Today's Good News Network, where kids can actually like engage with things that are appropriate or feel comfortable with. There's also like Smithsonian for Kids, things like that, where kids can read and learn things and like bring them back to the dinner table with you and talk and share with their families what they've learned. I think, the possibilities are endless. And Brent, you just hit the nail on the head when it's like, what did we do before all of these things? Like before we all had an iPad and before we all had smartphones, we talked to each other and we had hobbies and interests and things that were really meaningful to us. So just closing that loop there, and then thinking forward, after this week of spring break or even after April 6th, like what we as educators can do in terms of organizing online learning and connecting with our kids is huge. We're working with some schools right now who are like transitioned immediately into online connection and learning and didn't have this space. And so they begin their days with small videos to students that they send to parents' emails. So I'm your teacher. You feel safe and connected to me. I want you still here. I miss you. Here's what the day could look like. Here is an activity. I think that human element is just like so critical. Even if it's a Facebook Live that parents who have Facebook access could get on. Any sort of like video connection would be very helpful or meaningful. Any sort of notes or postcards that you can send to your kids if this is stretched out for a really long period of time. Any pictures that you've taken throughout the year in your classroom that you can shoot to families and emails to remind students of like that safe place and that we're all still here and in this together and in this community. If there are tons of teachers that use apps like Remind Me, so sending messages and schedules out like that, sending links to slide decks that take you through the day. Jean sent an incredible resource from OPSRC today with slide decks really thought out and a structure incredibly thought out with a video overlay what the day could look like, and teachers are sharing that with students, and that's accessible to kids as young as like 4 and 5, the way that it was laid out, all the way to high school. And I know OPSRC also has an incredible resource site, and I'm sure it will be linked, Brent, that will include that.
And it's getting updated right now. It's a little
Awesome.
little hairy right now, but yeah, we're rapidly trying to get useful information up there for schools. Yeah.
And so I would also think about the opportunities that you have to access Zoom right now. There are free educator accounts. And so how can we do read alouds together? Like, I got a book at home. If you have that tech access, let's do it. I literally just got off of a read aloud with Carter right before I joined this podcast with about 12 other kids from across the nation. And we read 2 books and they talked about it and they got to flail all over the place and just be kids and listen and learn. And so, there are sites like celebrities reading books with YouTube links if you're unable to do Zoom. And then I think what's helpful too is from a teacher perspective to lend to parents, like, what are some discussion questions? Because we may not be used to asking those questions when we do read alouds or when we engage in the news. What kinds of things should we be asking our kids? If you could provide us with any sort of structure for that, it would be really helpful. And I know a real concern and a worry is like internet access, honestly, especially in some of our rural communities. And so right now, some of our schools with that same issue are doing pickups like daily or weekly. And so they'll schedule a time from 10:30 to 12:30 to say, come pick up your packet, which also includes like teacher individualized messages to students, but work that they can engage in, projects, lots of discussion questions. If you don't have a ton of books at home, print out some kid-friendly articles and include in those packets along with some discussion questions. I know our libraries are closing, and that's what a lot of us depend on to access books. So any sort of like e-reader, or there are tons of like YouTube videos of just books being read, right? So what sort of discussion questions, and then just to add into, as teachers and I think for parents, there are many terrible things about Facebook, but I think in a way that people are coming together right now, there's also some good stuff coming out. There's a science mom. It's literally, if you type in science mom, every day she's doing science experiments and like showing those and asking kids questions. So if you need some screen time where like kids can just engage because you need to get some work done, and that's reality, that's an option. There are also art lessons online. Art teachers are getting on and sharing like the project of the day, which is one the other day was create a mixed up animal, right? And then write about that mixed up animal. But I think what's important to like not discount is that this looks very different for a 4 and 5-year-old than it does for a student in high school. And so encourage people like OPSRC and also Transcend to continue to curate resources that will support teachers and families with a variety of age ranges.
Yeah. Yeah, so we touched on a lot of different things here. Just, this is this. So again, we're recording on March 17th. Some things are going to change, and I want to preface everything. If teachers are trying to connect with students, I think that's fantastic as long as it's virtually. Let's make sure we're not getting anybody together, right? And one of the equity issues is around Wi-Fi. Sadly, one of the easiest ways to get Wi-Fi is to go to Starbucks or McDonald's or the library, and that ain't good options, right? I think Wi-Fi is probably the most, or just connectivity in general is my biggest concern. Also, endpoint technology for students. So just the next podcast that we're recording is focusing on what can schools do to help address sort of just general connectivity issues as we potentially move into a more distance virtual education world, and how can we address those important equity issues. But we should probably tackle that a little bit here as well. Why don't we jump in there, Wes, to talk about that a little bit?
Can I do another thought actually that doesn't tie to that?
We'll come back.
Here's a plug. So in terms of content, PBS, fantastic resource. PBS Kids, depending on the age of your kids. PBS has a whole website called PBS Learning Media. That content is fantastic. But let me just put in a quick plug for coding, right? My wife has used, PBS has an app called PBS Scratch Junior, and it ties to MIT's Project Scratch. I love helping my students learn to create animations, telling stories, the ways that these tutorials are already there. So these are things that, involve some connectivity, but encourage your kids to explore. There are literally millions of projects in multiple languages on the Scratch website. You can just Google Scratch MIT. And if your kids are like third grade and below, Scratch Junior. There's a Scratch Junior app for iPad and Android. There's also a PBS that uses the PBS characters that's available. Sometimes we're intimidated with coding and, with all of technology. The kids seem to be faster and further ahead than we are, but there's a lot of really good learning. And I think finding curated environments. One of the things you don't want is your kid to hang out on a Discord chat server talking to strangers for a long time, or maybe even at all, right? I mean, we had questions about that at school, like, hey, we're going to set up Discord. I mean, there are no parental controls for Discord. The setting on preferences there literally says live on the dark side. One of the things we need to be talking about too is security and safety. We need to be securing our passwords. We need to be ready as schools to reset passwords. And if something happens to your account, you need to make sure that you can reset that because, hey, people are going to be, at home with a lot more time on their hands. And we want everyone hopefully to be using their time in constructive ways. So anyway, just a quick plug for coding there. Check out Scratch. It's fantastic. PBS resources are fantastic as well. And again, Facebook, these communities, we're gonna see some really good things emerge. And so being connected parents, being connected educators, and being generous sharers, right? It's a fantastic time for all of that to happen. And I think that we just want to also work with our kids together as we figure this out because it's some new territory. But thankfully, we've never had better collaborative tools that can help us do what we're doing right now in this podcast and much more. And I think we want to step into those opportunities, not just telling the kids, hey, we got it all figured out, but also saying, hey, here's some ideas. This is what I'm thinking. Giving them a chance to help brainstorm and co-create some of the activities and challenges that we'll do because it's amazing what creativity folks have when they've got limited resources and opportunities. And Science Mom and some of those resources that Jamila shared are fantastic. And we're in this day, right, where you can say something like Science Mom YouTube, boom, and then you go and find it. So the opportunities like that for collaboration are going to lead us in some really good places.
Yeah, I don't want to sugarcoat it, but I do think that we have an opportunity here, right? Like, in the political world, we say never waste a good crisis, right? And this gives us an opportunity to explore. Like my daughter downloaded Babbel, and she started learning Spanish the other day, so which is kind of exciting. I mean, there's unstructured time. And remember when, I don't know what you guys, but my parents said, see you when it gets dark out, right? And kicked us out of the house. And I'm not suggesting that as maybe always, especially right now in the quarantine world, but that same kind of like unstructured time, I think our kids in our highly structured world today lack that, and maybe this gives us an opportunity.
And one other quick thing, I'm going to make a video about it, but we need to talk right at the outset about responsible use and digital citizenship. You know, we have kids sign that. We switched over from an acceptable use policy a couple of years ago, and we have that looks different in elementary than it does in middle and high school. But we need to talk about those things, and we need to check in, because guess what? The stuff that happens at school with bullying, we know this stuff happens online. There's content, there are places, there are people that our kids can be, you know, encountering. And because we're going to be spending so much more time online, and there's a lot of potential there where check-ins and communication and accountability and all those things are just super, super important. So again, I think resources are going to come to be present, but not being afraid to ask your kid, you know, hey, let's take a look at your texts, you know, let me look at your device, and these kinds of check-ins together. Set that expectation right from the outset that, hey, these are our family devices. I'm paying these bills, and I reserve the right at any time to be able to have you open that up and to look at this. And that is a challenging thing, but those conversations are going to be as important as they always have been. We're going to be spending more time there, so maybe they're even more important.
I couldn't agree more on that.
Can I add one thing in, Brent, before we wrap up?
Yeah.
If there was anything as an educator that I would do right now in this very uncertain time, is begin surveying families and maybe even kids as well on what access looks like at home, and who is at home with you if possible, like, you know, what supports are there available, and then what do parents need and what do kids need from us right now. I think there's nobody that can differentiate like an Oklahoma educator. And it's very hard to do unless we know the answers to some of these questions. What do kids really need? What do families really need? And what is their access level right now, so that we can begin planning in meaningful ways?
And I'd say, how many devices do you have? Because when we initially surveyed, we didn't say, and do you have a device for each member of your family? Because, you know, we've got multiple, you know, siblings and families, et cetera. So yeah, those things can help shape, you know, what we do. And then also, you know, the access to the phone. Hopefully this is a common denominator where we'll have some digital ways to be able to, you know, get that access, but finding out where we're at, and then what are we going to do with this access and these tools? That's going to be our challenged opportunity here in the weeks ahead.
Indeed. Just so everyone's aware, this is the second of our sort of 4 podcast series just today. We wanted to get some stuff out. First, we focused on food and nutrition. We've just focused on sort of, you know, educational resources for folks. We're going to talk about technology next, and get into a lot of that social equity piece. And then the fourth one is probably the one that's, I think, maybe even the most important, which is just talking about how we take care of each other right now, and mental health and wellness. So I'm going to get all this up today. Thank you in advance to our director of communications, who gets to go through and clean all this up and make sure it gets out. So that's Sarah Julian. And then tomorrow, what I want to turn our attention toward is how do we start getting resources out to teachers, like for professional development in this whole new world that's been thrust upon us. One other thing I'd like to encourage both you guys for participating here today, but also just anyone that's listening is if there are resources that you have that you think we should have, please send it to us. Let me just give you my info. It's Brent, Brent, .bushy at opsrc.net. That's email, and cells 405-820-3619. Get it to me. I'm quite practically useless other than connecting to other people that are smart, but that's my job. And we'll either, you know, run down questions and answers. The more questions people ask, the better we can do our job. The more resources people send, the more we can distribute. But, you know, as we turn to all of these, we don't know where this is going to go from here. We want to be a resource. We want to connect with others. There's all kinds of folks. State Department, I think, is doing a heck of a job with what's been thrown at them. I've seen School Board Association focusing on sort of legal issues for schools. I think that's fantastic. We're going to need everybody to kind of pitch in together to get there. So
I'm W. Fryer on Twitter, and our website, where we're building out all our instructional resources for teachers, is on a public Google site, and it's support.casady.org. And those resources are going to continue to grow. When I've built those out, sort of like, are you using Seesaw? Are you using Google Classroom? And then a 4-part, do you want to deliver instruction? Do you want to interact with students? Do you want to assess, or do you need support? And so anyway, those resources are going to continue to build out in the weeks ahead, I'm sure.
That's awesome. Thanks, Wes, for your leadership on that. Jamila, any final words here?
I am not Twitter famous, Brent Bushy, so I will just I will just keep sending resources OPSRC's way. I know you're talking about mental health next, but in case it doesn't get touched on, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has materials for talking about coronavirus with your own children, doing activities that help them process and think through it with no supplies. So
Great.
make sure
That's up on Transcend's website, right?
it is.
Good. Yeah, I saw that and was definitely going to highlight today during our podcast. So, all right, y'all. I really appreciate the time. I know you're busy, and really appreciate you taking time to help out here. Have a great one.
Thanks. We'll be in touch.